The night I called him, I was sitting on the bathroom floor of an apartment I'd been too scared to leave for 6 months. The door had a crack in it from where Brandon had slammed it 2 hours earlier. Not with his fist this time, with my head. I didn't call 911. I know how that sounds. I've asked myself 1,000 times why I didn't. Why my first instinct was to scroll past the emergency number and land on his name instead. All I can tell you is that when you've been with someone like Brandon for long enough, you stop trusting your own judgment about who's safe. And somehow, even then, even after everything, I knew that Calloway was. His full name was Desmond Calloway. Most people who worked at Calloway & Associates called him Mr. Calloway, and I was no exception. I was his paralegal, had been for almost 2 years. And in those 2 years, I'd seen him walk into a room and make men twice his size go quiet just by standing still. I'd seen him win cases that should have been impossible. I'd seen him look at opposing counsel the way a hawk looks at something small and unfortunate in an open field. I'd also seen him, once in November, leave a warm coat on the bench outside the building where a man was sleeping. He didn't say anything about it. He just walked inside. That was the version of Desmond Calloway I called that night. My hands were shaking so badly I almost couldn't press the screen. It rang twice. Lawson. He never said hello, just whatever name he needed to locate you. Mr. Calloway. My voice came out so small I almost didn't recognize it. I'm sorry to call so late. I didn't know who else to. A pause. Brief. But I heard something shift in it. Where are you? I told him the address. My voice broke on the street name and I hated myself for it. Don't open the door for anyone until I get there, he said. You understand me? Yes. Are you hurt? I looked at my reflection in the mirror above the sink. My bottom lip was split. There was a bruise beginning to form under my left eye that I already knew would be purple by morning. A little, I said. He hung up. No reassurance. No, it's going to be okay. No, stay calm. Just the clean efficiency of someone already moving. I sat on that cold tile floor and waited. And for the first time in months, I felt something other than afraid. I should tell you about Brandon first. Because the story doesn't make sense without him, even though I wish it did. We met at a birthday party for a mutual friend. The kind of party where you end up talking to someone in the kitchen because the living room is too loud. He was funny. That's what I remember first. He made me laugh harder than I had in a long time. He asked questions and actually waited for the answers. He texted me the next morning and said he'd been thinking about something I'd said about my job. And could I tell him more about it? I was 26. I'd just moved to Cincinnati after law school left me, burned out and broke. I was renting a room from a stranger I found on Craigslist and eating a lot of store-brand pasta. Brandon seemed, at the time, like proof that something good was coming. The first sign I missed was small. We'd been dating about 3 months when I got a promotion at work. Just a title change, really, but I was proud of it. I told him at dinner and he said, "Oh, so you'll be working even more hours now." Not congratulations, not that's great, just that. I told myself he was tired. I kept telling myself versions of that for the next 2 years. By the time I understood what was happening, I was living in his apartment, working a job he'd suggested. I take because it was more stable than the firm I'd originally wanted to apply to. And I'd quietly stopped seeing most of my friends because it was easier than dealing with his mood afterward. I had $340 in a checking account he technically didn't have access to, but somehow always knew the balance of. My name wasn't on the lease. My car needed a repair I couldn't afford, and every time I thought about leaving, I thought, leave to go where? That's the thing nobody tells you about this kind of relationship. It's not just the fear. It's the way you slowly become someone who can't imagine a different life, because the person standing next to you has made sure of it. The night I called Desmond, Brandon had come home and found out I'd had lunch with a coworker, a woman. It didn't matter. He'd thrown a glass across the kitchen, screamed things I won't repeat here, and when I'd tried to walk away, he'd grabbed my arm and pushed me into the bathroom door hard enough that I'd hit the frame on the way down. Then he'd driven away, and I'd sat there on the floor and thought, very clearly, this is the last time. I didn't know what came after that thought. I just knew I meant it. Desmond arrived in 22 minutes. I know because I watched the clock the entire time. When I opened the door, he was still in his work clothes, charcoal slacks, his shirt untucked at the collar, sleeves rolled to the elbow. He took one look at my face, and something in his expression went very, very still. The way a river goes still right before it floods. He didn't say, "Oh my God," or "What happened?" He stepped inside, looked around the apartment once like he was cataloging something, and then looked back at me. "Do you have things you need to take?" Yes. "Some. Then let's get them." He stood in the hallway while I moved through the apartment in a kind of dissociated trance, pulling clothes off hangers and stuffing them into a bag. My laptop, my grandmother's ring that I'd been careful to keep in a drawer, Brandon never opened, my passport, a folder of documents I'd quietly assembled over the past few months, half out of habit and half out of some survival instinct I hadn't fully acknowledged. I was in the bedroom when I heard Brandon's car in the driveway. I froze. Desmond appeared in the doorway a second later. He looked at me, then at the window. "Finish packing," he said quietly. I know, finish packing." I don't know exactly what was said in that front hallway. I heard voices, Brandon's raised, Desmond's low and level, and then I heard silence. The kind of silence that has weight to it. When I came out with my bag, Brandon was standing against the wall, with an expression I'd never seen on his face before. Something very close to fear. Desmond was standing in the center of the room, not touching him, not threatening him, just looking at him, like he was something small and unfortunate in an open field. "Is that everything?" Desmond asked me without looking away from Brandon. "Yes, then we're done here." He picked up my bag before I could and walked me to his car. Brandon didn't follow. We drove in silence for a few minutes. The city was quiet. There was a late-night radio station playing something low and forgettable. I stared at my hands in my lap and tried to figure out what to do with the feeling that had replaced the fear. Something weightless and enormous and almost incomprehensible. "Where am I taking you?" Desmond asked. "I don't." My throat tightened. "I don't really have anywhere." He was quiet for a moment. "My building has a guest unit," he said. "You can stay there as long as you need to. Mr. Calloway, I can't ask you to." "You didn't ask," I offered. He glanced over at me, just briefly. "There's a difference." I looked out the window. The street lights blurred a little at the edges. "Thank you," I said. He didn't say of course or no problem, or any of the things people usually say. He just nodded once, like the matter was settled, and drove. The guest unit was on the 4th floor of a building in Hyde Park, a neighborhood I'd always driven through and thought, someday maybe. The apartment was small but spotless. Cream walls, wooden floors, a kitchen with a window that looked out over a courtyard with a maple tree in it. There were fresh towels in the bathroom. The bed had actual good sheets, the kind with a thread count I'd never been able to justify spending money on. I sat down on the edge of it and didn't move for a long time. I didn't sleep much that first night. I kept waking up and thinking I heard his car. I kept reaching, in the dark, for the other side of the bed. Not because I missed Brandon, I want to be clear about that, but because the body doesn't know it's safe yet, even when you do. The body takes longer. In the morning, there was a bag outside my door. Inside, a carton of orange juice, a box of the good granola bars, and an envelope with the name and number of an attorney who specialized in protective orders. No note. I stood in the doorway in my socks and felt something in my chest do something complicated. I went back to work 3 days later. Part of me wanted to take more time. Most of me knew that if I gave myself too much stillness, I'd start listening to the voice that sounded like Brandon. The one that said I'd overreacted, that it hadn't been that bad, that I'd ruined everything over nothing. I knew that voice. I'd heard it so many times it had started to sound like my own. So I went back. Desmond treated me exactly the same as he always had. That was more than I'd expected, and exactly what I needed. He didn't hover. He didn't ask careful questions in careful tones. He handed me a deposition file and said, "I need this indexed by noon," and walked back to his office, and I sat at my desk and did my job, and I felt something that took me a while to identify. Normal. I felt normal. What I noticed, quietly, over the weeks that followed, was smaller than you'd expect. The way he positioned himself between me and the door whenever we walked out of a meeting together. The time I came in looking worse than usual. I'd had a hard night, the kind where the memories you're trying to outrun catch up, and he moved my afternoon tasks around without comment, giving me quieter work. He never mentioned it. I mentioned it once, obliquely. "You didn't have to do that," I said. "The rescheduling." He looked up from his desk. The Kelton brief needed editing anyway. That was it. No, I was worried about you. No, I noticed you seemed off. Just the fiction of practicality, offered with such ease that I almost believed it. I started to see the shape of him more clearly those months. Desmond Calloway was the kind of man who'd been described, at various points, using words like ruthless and cold and calculated. Opposing counsel said he had no conscience. Some of his clients said he scared them a little, even when he was on their side. What I saw, from where I sat, was something more precise. A man who did not waste motion. He didn't perform warmth he didn't feel, which meant that when something in him shifted, you knew it was real. There was a night in February, about 4 months after I'd moved into the guest unit, when he came home late and knocked on my door. I'd been awake anyway, reading. He looked tired in a way I didn't see on him often. The Callahan verdict came in, he said. I heard. I'm sorry. He leaned against the doorframe. You want to know something? I knew we were going to lose. I knew it 3 weeks ago. It didn't stop being a loss. I thought about that. Does it ever get easier, losing cases? No. He looked at me steadily. But that's not the same as it getting unbearable. I nodded slowly. I think about that sometimes. The difference between hard and too hard. Something changed in his expression. It happened so quickly I wasn't sure I'd seen it. Yeah, he said quietly. So do I. He said goodnight and went back upstairs. I sat with the book open in my lap and didn't read another word. 6 months after I moved in, I started therapy. I want to say this clearly, the way it deserves to be said. It was the hardest and most important thing I did that year, maybe in that order. My therapist's name was Dr. Avra Osi, a woman in her 50s with an office full of plants and a habit of asking the exact question I was hoping to avoid. In our 3rd session, she said, "Tell me what you think you deserve. Not what you've been told, what you actually believe." I sat with that for a long time. I think I used to believe I deserved more than I settled for, I finally said. And then I was with Brandon long enough that I stopped being able to tell the difference. And now, I thought about orange juice and granola bars outside a door. I thought about someone driving 22 minutes in the middle of the night, without asking why, just where. I'm starting to remember, I said. I'm not going to tell you that therapy fixed everything. It didn't. Some nights were still bad. There was a week in April where I couldn't walk past a certain kind of car without my hands going cold. There were triggers I hadn't even named yet, buried in ordinary moments. The sound of keys in a lock, someone raising their voice at a restaurant, the particular way a room changes when someone in it gets angry. But I kept going, every Tuesday at 4 o'clock, and slowly, the space between the bad nights got wider. Brandon tried. That's the part people don't always believe, but it's true. About 2 months after I left, he showed up at Desmond's building. Not at my door, but at the lobby. He told the doorman he was there to see me. The doorman called up. Desmond took the call, not me. I don't know what he said. I know it was brief. I know Brandon didn't come back. What Brandon did do, because he couldn't help himself, was send messages. From different numbers, from email addresses I didn't recognize, once through a mutual friend, who I think genuinely didn't know what she was being used for. The messages ranged from apologetic to accusatory to threatening, sometimes within the same paragraph. I documented every one of them the way the attorney had told me to. It took 3 months, a restraining order, and a court appearance I was terrified of and somehow survived, but eventually, it stopped. Not all at once. These things don't end all at once. But the silence, when it finally came, felt different from the silence I used to live in. The old silence had been full of held breath. This one just sounded like an ordinary Tuesday. I cried the day the restraining order was finalized. Happy tears, the messy kind, in the hallway outside the courtroom. The attorney, the one whose number had been in that envelope outside my door, handed me a packet of Kleenex from her briefcase with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this before. "You did good," she said. I know she probably says that to everyone. I didn't care. I needed to hear it. I moved out of the guest unit in the summer. I'd been saving for months. Carefully, deliberately. The way you do when you've spent years with someone who made you feel like money was a kind of permission they could give or take away. I found a studio apartment in Northside, on the 3rd floor of a building with a radiator that clanged in the winter, and a landlord named Pete who fixed things when you asked. I painted the kitchen wall a shade of yellow that was probably too bright, and I loved it completely. I still worked at Calloway & Associates. Some people thought that was strange, given everything. A few of my coworkers who knew the broad strokes asked if I was going to transfer. I thought about it for about 48 hours, and then decided that I'd already lost enough things to Brandon. I wasn't going to lose the job I'd actually wanted. Desmond and I had a new kind of equilibrium. A little more careful, maybe. A little more aware of the other person. We worked well together. We always had. But there was something different now, something I didn't have a name for and wasn't ready to examine. What I can tell you is that he started doing this thing where he'd leave an extra coffee on my desk, on the mornings when the caseload was particularly brutal. Just there when I arrived, the right order without me mentioning it, like he'd noted at some point what I drank and filed it away. I noticed. I didn't say anything. There was a Friday evening in September when everyone else had gone home, and we were still in the conference room with the Hargrove files spread across the table. The case had been going on for months, and we were finally in the last stretch. But the last stretch was always the worst part, the part where everything got fast and loud, and the margin for error went to 0. We'd been at it for 3 hours when I made a mistake in a date calculation that would have been fine if I'd caught it, but I didn't. And he did. And by the time we untangled it, we were both tired in the particular way that makes everything a little more honest than it should be. "You should go home," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "We can pick this up Monday." "So can you," I said. He looked at me. "You work too hard," I said, and then immediately wished I could take it back because it was too personal, too much like something someone who cared about him would say, and not something an employee would say. "I mean, the firm. I know what you meant." He was quiet for a moment. Nobody's said that to me in a long time. The room was very still. The building had that empty Friday night quality, the hum of the HVAC, the distant sound of a cleaning cart on another floor. "I'm sorry," I said, though I wasn't entirely sure what I was apologizing for. "Don't be." He looked at the files instead of me. It was worth hearing. I drove home that night with the windows down, even though it was getting cold, just because I needed the air. I sat in my yellow kitchen with a cup of tea and thought about the way he'd said worth hearing, and what that meant, and what I wanted it to mean. I didn't have an answer yet, but I was starting to understand that I was allowed to want one. It was October when I finally said it. We were outside the courthouse after a hearing that had gone well, genuinely well, the kind where the whole walk back to the car feels lighter. He was next to me, his jacket over one arm, squinting a little in the afternoon sun. I'd been carrying something around in my chest for weeks that I kept moving past without looking at directly. "Desmond," I said. He turned to look at me. That was the first time I'd used his first name. I think he noticed. I think he'd been waiting. "I don't know how to do this," I said. "I know that's not. I know I should probably have something more articulate than that. I want to say thank you. Not for that night, or not only for that night, for all of it. For treating me like a person when I'd mostly forgotten what that felt like." I stopped, steadied myself. "And I want to tell you that I noticed things. I noticed the coffee. I noticed the way you stood between me and the lobby door last Tuesday and probably didn't even think about it. I notice you, Desmond. I have for a long time, and I'm in a different place now than I was. So I wanted you to know." He was very quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that has nothing in it except attention. "I wasn't going to say anything," he said finally. "I want you to know that. I wasn't going to be the person who put pressure on you when you were still finding your footing. I know, but you should also know." He looked at me, direct and unhurried, the way he looked at things he'd already decided about, "that you've been it for me, for a while now, since before any of this." A pause. "That first November, you stayed until 9 on the Morrow case. You brought coffee for the whole team, including the first year who'd spilled hers. You didn't do it to be noticed. I noticed anyway." I stood there on the courthouse steps in the October sun, feeling something very quiet and very large settle into place. "That's a very specific thing to remember," I said. "I remember specific things," he said. "About you." I almost laughed. I felt the back of my eyes go warm. "So what do we do with that?" He looked at me for a long moment. Then, for the first time in the 2 years I'd known him, Desmond Calloway looked almost uncertain. "I'd like to take you to dinner," he said. "If you want. No pressure. No, I'm not asking for anything except dinner. Just dinner?" To start, I looked at him. This man who had driven 22 minutes in the middle of the night, and not asked for anything in return. This man who left coats on benches and coffee on desks and attorneys' phone numbers in envelopes, and said I offered when you tried to thank him. This man who looked at you like you were worth his full attention and meant it. Okay, I said. His expression shifted, just slightly. Something in it opened. Friday, he said, Friday. We walked back to the car. The afternoon was clear and cool and smelled like autumn. I didn't say anything else and neither did he. But when we reached the crosswalk, his hand found mine. Just briefly, just once. And then we kept walking. I thought about what Dr. Osi had asked me, months ago. What do you actually believe you deserve? I had the answer now. And it felt for the first time in a long time like something I was willing to ask for.